Szanowni Państwo, witam bardzo serdecznie w imieniu
Welcome,
Fundacji.
ladies and gentlemen, very warmly on behalf of Janusz Kurtyka Foundation to a meeting connected to the issue of impact of the First World War and the Battle of Lwów on Polish identity. The subject of the meeting today is not a coincidence. It is a motif that is connected to the books of Professor Andrzej Chwalba, Wielka Wojna Polaków, 1914-1918, The Great War of Poles, that is, and the book of Dr. Damian Markowski, Dwa powstania, Bitwa o Lwów 1918 to Uprisings, Battle of Lwów 1918. This meeting is connected to those books, and obviously it is also connected to their authors who are here with us. It's my great pleasure to present to you Professor Andrzej Chwalba, the author of The Great War of the Poles. Professor Chwalba is a historian connected to the Jagiellonian University. He is the head of the unit of historical anthropology. He deals with 19th and 20th century history of Poland, but also Polish-Russian relationships, the First World War, and also city history, especially Kraków. Professor Chwalba won the second round of Janusz Kurtyka Prize that our foundation presents to the best historical work on the subject of a specific edition. As your book won our competition, it's been translated to English and German and published in cooperation with Peter Lang Publishers. We also have the author of the other book, Dr. Damian Markowski. Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and he is a Polish historian of the young generation, and he is one of few in this generation to deal with the history of Eastern Europe and the borderland, the Eastern borderland. He is connected to the Institute for National Remembrance and also, in a sense, to the prize that we, as the foundation, award. He received it in the third edition of the competition, and his book was translated into English, German, and then published by our foundation in cooperation with Peter Lang Publishers. This meeting is exceptional not only because we have an opportunity to talk to the authors of the books, but also because it has brought together not only the authors, but also people who are connected to Polish history. May I welcome very warmly and thank for the presence of Professors John Radzilowski, a historian connected to the University of Alaska, but also St. Thomas University. Professor Radzilowski is an expert on the Polish diaspora in the United States and is also the author of Synthetic Polish History for Travelers, a compendium, a vademecum of Polish history for travelers. And during the meeting today, we'll have an opportunity also to listen to the professor's paper. We are very glad to have you among us and welcome cordially. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more person to present, and that is a most unique person, and in a moment I'll tell you why. May I welcome very, very warmly Professor John Hittinger from the University of St. Thomas, director of St. John Paul II Institute. Good evening.
Good evening.
Dobry. Why did I say that the professor is an exceptional person? He takes a perspective of a person promoting Polish history, and I must say that it's exceptionally important in this field to have somebody like that, somebody so constructive as Professor Hittinger, who professionally deals with philosophy, political philosophy, and the thought of John Paul II. But other than that, he is a friend of Poland, Poles, and the idea of promotion of Polish history. We had an opportunity to visit Professor in Houston in 2019 when we promoted Tadeusz Wolsza's book about cutting. Thank you very much, Professor, for that meeting. And we'd also like to thank for agreeing to cooperate with us and for this opportunity to discuss Polish history again, even though the subjects might have changed. Now, that short introduction will be a very good background and an opportunity to ask Professor Hittinger for a short introduction, an expert and introduction into the content of today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Łukasz Płoski, and I also thank Paweł Kurtyka. It is my honor to join you again in this venture to put forward Polish history for people to understand its very important role in the history of Europe and the world. And as you mentioned, I am the director of the John Paul II Institute. And I would say one of the unique things we are trying to do with this institute is to see the intimate connection between the life and thought of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, and Polish history and culture. They are joined in our mission that we promote both, because I think to understand John Paul II is to be led to Polish history and culture. And I do think that as one studies 20th century history of Poland, John Paul II certainly stands up as one of the great leaders of Poland and indeed the world. So I would just like to say a couple words to help introduce what we're doing to some of the viewers who may be new, just learning about Polish history. If you don't mind, I'll show a slide or two. If I could have that enabled on the screen sharing, Łukasz. I think you need to enable that, because I would like to explain that John Paul II, in one of his last books, is called Rise, Let Us Be on Our Way. They are memoirs about becoming a bishop. And in there, it's very interesting to see how much, well, some interesting references to Lwów pop up. It's not, again, a coincidence that this topic is important for Polish history, but I think also we'll see it in the life of John Paul II. So I'm just going to briefly mention this. First of all, for those who are just learning about Poland, if you don't mind, I'll read a short comment by Oscar Swan in his Kaleidoscope of Poland, a cultural encyclopedia. In there, he says, Lwów or Lviv is a town of over 700,000 residents in Western Ukraine. Until 1939, Lwów belonged to Poland and was mostly Polish in population, 60% Polish, 30% Jewish, 10% Ukrainian. After the war, the Polish population was forcibly repatriated to the so-called recovered territories, many to Lower Silesia, but it's still treated by Poles as belonging to their cultural heritage. And I think it was part of the project of Karol Wojtyła and John Paul II to see the church in Poland as a guardian of the culture and history of Poland, which he said he brought with him to the papacy. Many of the lessons of toleration, of endurance and courage, of love of freedom, of the arts and beauty and philosophy, these are all so well instantiated and embodied in the over 1,000-year history of Poland. And so in this book on his memoirs of the becoming a bishop, Rise, Let Us Be on Our Way, I thought I would just show you here briefly. He talks about his consecration as bishop, and this is what jumped out at me. You see that he said, this Archbishop Baziak, who was the apostolic administrator of Krakow, was actually the Bishop of Lwów, who was exiled from the city after the war. And his line of consecration, those who are Catholic know this apostolic succession shows this continuity with the apostles. But if you look at what I have on the screen, 3 of the bishops immediately in that line, Baziak, Twardowski, and Bilchevsky, were all bishops of Lwów. And then John Paul II, one of his best friends and colleagues in philosophy, Marian Jaworski, became apostolic administrator of Lubachov and then Archbishop of Lviv. So the life of Lviv is very connected to Krakow in the 20th century, even after it was lost to Poland after the war. And John Paul II sees in the witness of these bishops a great spiritual heritage and courage. And I won't go over all the details here, but he does mention Baziak was a displaced person who was taken under the wing of Cardinal Sapieha to serve him as coadjutor. But again, an interesting part of history, when Baziak first met the young Wojtyła to tell him he would be made a bishop, he exclaimed, "Habemus Papam," which John Paul II later said was a prophetic statement by that man that he would become Pope. So I will just close my remarks to say that I think this topic is of great interest for those who have an interest in John Paul II to know how this formed Polish consciousness continues to do so, and how John Paul II was deeply influenced by the men who were from Lwów and were the patriots and spiritual leaders of the generation, even when this war was underway. So again, thank you for inviting us to be co-host. I look forward to hearing these talks, and now turn it back to you, Łukasz, to introduce or to turn it over to our first speaker.
Jeszcze, szanowni państwo, zanim rozpoczniemy sesję.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, before we start the session of the papers, may I ask for some more words. Professor Hittinger said why this subject is so important for his institute. Could I also ask for a few words, Paweł Kurtyka, the president of Janusz Kurtyka Foundation? Could you please say why we deal with this subject and why we gather around these books and not any others? And also, please present this project background of the meeting that has gathered us here today. Mr. President, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Hittinger, for all those great words, for such a fantastic introduction into this subject, the leading subject of the day. Now, may I return for a brief moment from the space of history to the current time, so that I could say a word or two about this project. This is the second meeting with the professor. Our first opportunity came when we were talking about Professor Wolsza's book, which the professor organized together with us. These were still the days before the pandemic, and now those two further works, the Great War of the Poles and the two uprisings, the Battle of Lwów by Dr. Markowski, are a continuation of the same project. We go on persistently. We work on things that concern important moments in Polish history. And for that reason, we can today talk about the time of the First World War, the period that you so greatly described, Professor. It was a moment from which, a period from which John Paul II grew.
Basically, it's about building certain foundations in terms of the worldview. So here, let me highlight something. Our authors have described certain historical spaces, and they deal with two important, well, not so much facts, but rather phenomena in the Polish history. So, the people of Poland at war, this the Battle of Lwów, these are a part and parcel of this founding myth of the identity. Until this very day, it forms an important part of the Polish identity. We are talking about an important section of this whole process of regaining the Polish identity. So there was this moment when Poland, after 123 years of national vacuum, and it was reconstituting itself and finding its way to the European political maps. But here we're dealing with something else in the other book, namely what the Polish society had to go through. We learn there what kind of sacrifice was linked to the war, the occupation, and the result of the military marches, what the impact was of Poland being a frontline country in this great war where great armies clashed. So basically the professor discusses not so much the battles themselves, but rather the impact, what it meant for an average person to be there, to live in a country where those activities took place. And how, despite so much distraction, it was possible for this country and this society to reject the Soviet invasion in 1920. And it happened at the Battle of Warsaw. So this background described by the professor is very important. And it is really important if we try to understand the history of Poland and if we want to go deeper and learn it truly. So I'm really happy about this meeting today. I'm sure that Łukasz will help us to encourage you to learn more about the books. And now, let's give the floor to the historians. Let them tell us what they write about so that they can introduce you into this world, the world of events gone by. Thank you, President. Let us move to the key part of our meeting tonight. John Radziłowski. Sir, would you please take the floor?
Thank you, Dzień dobry. I will briefly share my screen. Let's see here. Well, thank you all, and I will speak briefly this morning on the topic of American Polonia and the First World War. Hopefully, picking up on some of the themes that my co-presenters will talk about, particularly with the focus on identity. And obviously the First World War and the Battle for Lwów were crucial for the history of Poland, for the history of the identity, the Polish identity within Poland. But these events are also a watershed for American Polonia and its identity, its sense of who it was. Now, by the time of the First World War, there are between 2 and 3 million Poles had immigrated to the United States and settled throughout the country, particularly in the East and Midwest. And although this was a largely working class a group of people who were often on the lowest end of the economic spectrum in the United States, by the time of the First World War, American Polonia had developed a very large and extensive institutional life. It had founded hundreds of parishes and hundreds of schools. It had founded some large organizations, particularly fraternal societies. It had hospitals, charitable organizations, thousands of social and fraternal and cultural organizations, libraries, including a number of colleges. So it was really quite well developed. Now, when Polish immigration began in the 19th century, there was great concern in Poland about the potential loss of population to the homeland under the partitions. But it became very clear, and certainly after the January insurrection, this was a topic of great concern. But it began to appear as Poles began to immigrate to the United States, they began to develop a very strong sense of Polish consciousness within the United States, and to the extent to which by the beginning of the 20th century, many, including many of the leaders of American Polonia, referred to themselves as the fourth partition of Poland, as a form of as an integral part of the Polish nation, but simply physically removed from Poland itself. And by the time of the First World War, American Polonia was increasingly acting on behalf of Poland in international forums. They were attempting to represent Poland in, or Polish interests at least, on an international scene, certainly within the United States, but even to some extent within Europe. And often in cooperation with groups of Polish exiles in places like France or Switzerland. And so when the First World War arrives, American Polonia, in a sense, begins to mobilize itself. Now, of course, in the beginning, there is no Poland. Poland is divided, of course, as we know, into three sectors. And Poles are actually fighting one another in the early years of the war. But there is great concern about the problems that Poland is facing, certainly the humanitarian problems. It became very clear that Poland was a major battleground on the Eastern Front for the armies of Russia, Austria, Hungary, and Germany. People were being displaced, famine, refugees, and the humanitarian issue was the first one that comes to the fore. And already in 1914, but more substantially by 1915 and 1916, American Polonia is beginning to raise a significant amount of money within its own organizations for Polish relief, and illustrations like this give us some sense of the urgency that was being considered here in the press, and there were public meetings, and these millions of people were beginning to organize themselves organizationally to provide assistance to Poland. Now, obviously, an important figure in all of this was Ignacy Jan Paderewski, the famous pianist, and his wife Helena, who came to the United States and began to work with leaders of American Polonia. Paderewski, of course, in modern terms, had star power. He was one of the great celebrities of his age, and so his public presence allowed American Polonia to reach a wider audience. We have to remember that this was a community that spoke largely Polish, was not highly regarded by the American mainstream or American leaders. But with Paderewski, they were able to access corridors of power that they hadn't accessed before. A very good example of this is the effort that began in 1915 to sell Polish relief dolls, and this is one example. They're very small dolls. They're often made by Polish women in the United States and sold to raise money for Polish relief. However, as we know, money was being raised, but it was not being received back in Europe because of the embargo, and it wasn't money couldn't be sent to Europe without it the danger of it being used by Germany or Austria for its own uses rather than being given to the refugees on the ground. So this effort increasingly became frustrated. American leaders in American Polonia became frustrated, and as a result, began to turn their activities from merely humanitarian relief toward more political goals. In 1917, of course, the United States joins the Entente powers, declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary, and enters the war itself. And this really sparks the mobilization of American Polonia. Probably the best example of this is the recruitment for the Polish army in the United States. And over the course of 1917, 1918, about 25,000 Polish Americans join a Polish army in the United States. We also have to remember at the same time that Poles who were already citizens of the United States are joining the American army in large numbers. Many of the recruiting stations within Polish neighborhoods, one could walk into the building and there was one desk for the American army, one desk for the Polish army. And if you weren't eligible for the American army, you could join the Polish army and vice versa. And so what we begin to see in this period is a merging of two different identities of American patriotism and Polish patriotism, in a sense, merging within the consciousness of American Polonia. All of the ideas of American patriotism, images of American history, are also being mobilized to the symbols of American patriotism and the symbols of Polish patriotism, in a sense, are being fused. And so figures like Kościuszko or Pulaski, we see these being employed frequently to encourage Poles in the United States to join, to assist the American war effort, but also as a way of helping the homeland. Even if you can't join the Polish army by joining the American army, you're also helping to bring about the freedom of Poland. So that this becomes a very important element. And as I said, about 25,000 Poles from the United States are join the Polish army. Many of them are trained in Canada, sent to France. Later, they'll join the regular Polish army in the Polish Bolshevik War, and many of them will serve throughout that conflict. At the same time, they are also mobilizing to raise money for the Polish cause, and this became increasingly urgent in 1917 and 1918, raising money for not only for Polish relief, but also for the Polish army itself. And also people were contributing to their own relatives once the war had ended and it was possible to send money directly. People are also directly assisting relatives. And scenes like this were very common throughout cities in the United States, and Poles are contributing large amounts of money. how much money was being contributed, and in fact, in many cases, you had in this instance, young Polish women standing on street corners with donation cans on major areas of American cities, getting contributions from other Americans. Overall, American Polonia contributed about $50 million to Poland, to the Polish army, to Polish bonds, Polish government during this period up through about 1922. This is a really astonishing amount of money, given that the average wage for a Polish worker in the United States was somewhere between $10 and $12 a week, and this was in a sense a very impoverished community, and yet it raises a tremendous amount of money. And this is in addition to contributing to the American war effort. The Poles, the United States, bought somewhere around $100 million worth of American war bonds during the same period. And so it's a tremendous outpouring of resources, both human resources and material resources. But I should also mention that not only were there soldiers that were coming to the United States, but also nurses. A whole program of Polish American women were recruited as nurses and social workers. I think most of our Polish colleagues are aware of the American relief effort spearheaded by future President Herbert Hoover, which saved the lives of millions of people in Poland in the years from 19...
Prezydent Herbert Hoover, który od 1918 roku do lat 20. zebrał dla Polski miliony dolarów. Wielu ludzi, którzy prowadzili ten program, to byli amerykańscy Polacy, młode kobiety, 19-20-latki, które jechały też do Polski po to, żeby pracować jako pielęgniarki i by pomagać swojej ojczyźnie. To właśnie polscy Amerykanie są, być może nie były one najbardziej widoczne, ale one razem z Polskim Czerwonym Krzyżem pod wodzą Heleny Paderewskiej były tymi, które były widoczne wśród amerykańskiej Polonii i to właśnie ich wysiłek był największy.
When Poland regains its independence at the end of the First World War and secures that with the defeat of Bolshevik armies in 1920, American Polonia, in a sense, reaches a crossroads. It has to decide: are we? There was a thought that many people would go back to Poland. These millions of people would return to Poland to rebuild the Polish homeland, and many people do go back. Not only the soldiers, but also individuals who want to return to their families. But when they arrive, they're not necessarily greeted as long lost brothers, but as sort of foreign interlopers. The period of living in the United States had inculcated many Polish Americans with sort of American ideas of how things ought to be done. So people returned to Poland hoping to, say, open a business, for example, and they found themselves very frustrated Poland, as we know, had been devastated by the war materially, and things. The government was in some level of chaos. There were three different parts of the economy, three different partitions that weren't fully integrated. So conditions were very, very difficult, and the Americans arrived with all their bright ideas. And they're not necessarily greeted with open arms. And even the veterans who had served in the Polish army, in many cases, were seen as foreigners. And the interesting part here is that in America, the Poles they're seen as Poles. They're viewed as Poles, but when they get to Poland, they're now viewed as Americans. And so there's, in a sense, what Polish Americans began to realize is their time in America had changed them. They had become Poles in an American context, not in a European context. And so their identity now becomes and many of them return, and they continue to feel very strongly Polish, but in a sense separate from Poland, and begin to develop their own identity within the United States as being not necessarily Polish in Poland, but Polish in the United States. And a whole new generation now comes to the fore that is focused on American affairs, on the affairs of the Polish community in the United States, and feels in some sense rejected by Poland, that we had offered, in a sense, there's a feeling of that we the Polish Americans had done these things for Poland, and we got to Poland, and then the Poles told us we weren't welcome here, and so there was, in a sense, a parting of the ways, but also a much stronger sense of being part of the United States. Just as many Poles had served in the Polish army, so too many Poles had served in the American army and done so with great distinction. And this was an ability, it gave Polish Americans an ability to claim a more prominent place within the United States. And so it's really during this period of the First World War that we see this transformation of American Polonia into, from in a sense, a group of exiles, if we will, to an American ethnic group that is still strongly rooted in Poland. And again, throughout the years that would come during the Second World War, but also during the Cold War, American Polonia again mobilizes on behalf of Poland, lobbies for the Polish cause in the United States and abroad, contributes materially, and even again volunteering for the Polish armed forces during the Second World War, but only in an American context, and no longer do they see themselves as the fourth partition, but as integrally part of the United States, a Polish part of the United States. And with that, I'll conclude, and I will turn this over to the moderators.
Bardzo dziękujemy za bardzo ciekawe wystąpienie, które
Thank you very much for this very interesting speech, which introduces us into the subject from a very different side and from the other side of the ocean. This is a side that is very different from what our authors are going to discuss. Without further ado, may I ask Professor Andrzej Chwalba, the author of The Great War of the Poles. Professor Chwalba, thank you very much. Good evening. Of course, I believe in the US it's still quite early in the morning, and so it is in Canada. It's my great pleasure and satisfaction. I have listened to both of you professors. I remember that Professor Radziłowski participated or intended to participate in the Third Congress in Krakow, the experts on Polish history. I remember the subject of his intended publication that was on the perception of Tadeusz Kościuszko in the United States. I'm so glad that we have Professor Radziłowski with us. And it's important to mention that in October 2020, there was this 5-year conference in Polish history. And in 2022, during the Congress, there will be more than 30 Congress panels, a huge project, and there will be around 240 moderators coming from 40 countries of the world, including Australia, and there will even be 2 from South Africa. And it proves that the Polish studies in Polish history are developing, and the meeting today also can be treated as an invitation of people who in the US are interested in studies of Polish history in the context of Central and Eastern Europe. After all, we are a part of Europe, we are a part of this region. So invitation to the Auditorium Maximum of the Jagiellonian University where the Congress will be held. At the same time, we start from a presentation of a prize. This is the statuette of Gallus Anonymous, a beautiful statue, a work of a great sculptor, and it comes with money. It is now about 30,000 zloty. Maybe it's not a lot in American dollars, but, well, I'm sorry, I have problems with the quality of the sound. I can hardly hear the professor, but it is still quite a significant amount of money. Also, all those who are listening to us, asking that they send to the Jagiellonian University, to the Institute of History, their books on the history of Poland, published in the last 5 years, published abroad, published in the US, in Canada, in other places around the world. They will be assessed by a jury. At the third Congress, we had Professor John Radzielowski, and there were nearly 200 books that were brought to this competition, and they came from the whole world, and we count on perfect books again. May I now tell you who the winners were, because that proves how important that is. Last time we had Robert Frost from Aberdeen. Before it was Antoni Poloński, a fantastic researcher of Polish-Jewish relations, a very honest and solid researcher. And the first prize went to someone known very well in Poland and the US, a professor of Yale University, Timothy Snyder. So these are great names in the European and global historiography. So we also count on the fourth Congress being the Congress when special prizes will be also delivered. Once again, let me invite you, October 2022, and please be sending in the books. Of course, we don't know about all of them, and many books are published in small imprints, small circulations. Some of them are hard to come by, and they may have powerful power of proof. I'm now going to pass on to our main subjects. This concerns one of the themes in my book, important, but it is interconnected with the global history, the tale about Poland and Poles, because this cultural history is connected to this history of deepening identification of national type, also religious cultural history, even with historical anthropology, and this environment, this milieu. It was winter and summer, and they were different circumstances, both for civilians and for the soldiers. And in our land, there are very different, and they made a major impact on the fates of people, on the fate of the same person, whether Pole, Jew, Belarusian, Ukrainian, and all the other people living in the Polish lands. A study of the national identity is by definition very difficult. And at the time, there were no research that is now simple and generally used, namely public opinion polls. No studies in sociology and politics were conducted, the ones that could answer this question.
So, complex issue. People were maturing, especially the peasants, and they constituted 75% of the Polish lands. Just as John Radzikowski has said, those peasant sons were very strongly represented and dominated this Polish ethnicity in the US. Now, what complicated things is this division into three partitions. There were those different partitioning powers. They might not have had a direct impact on national identification. And yet, they were trying to assimilate Poles into their own political and legal culture. Let's look at the German partition. The actors who tried to Germanize Poland, they were not so much trying to turn Poles into Germans, although that might have been the case, but they tried to turn them into Prussians that spoke Polish. They would speak in a Prussian way. They would have Prussian mentality, even though they might occasionally speak Polish. The same was true about the Prussian, or rather the Austrian partition. Yes, that's okay. They want to speak Polish if they will. They still would need to identify with Austria and Austrian identity. So that's the first thing that needs to be mentioned here. In the 19th century, certain changes in mentality did occur, and they did have an impact, and they continue to have an impact, but because there are certain differences in mentality between various regions. Those differences still persist. 5 generations of various public officials of the partition powers did make an impact. And another thing, lords and peasants, it was a conflict. I mean the Polish nobility and the Polish peasants. And it was quite strong both in the Austrian and in the Russian partitions. It was the partition powers that set the peasants free. They gave them land. So the fact that it was them who did that had a very important impact on those first 2 generations of peasants that basically gained liberty. They owed everything to emperors. And there was this myth of emperors, especially very strong in 2 partitions. And that made the work of the Polish patriots very difficult, because those Polish patriots wanted to implant this Polish myth in the minds of the Polish peasants. Let's look at the Russian powers. An attempt was made to turn the Polish peasants into a separate nation that would be loyal to Russia, loyal to Petersburg. Those people would, this nation would speak Polish, true, and yet it would be distant from the Polish idea of the Polish independence, which manifested itself in a number of uprisings in Poland. It was about separating various parts of the society, and the same was true about the Austrian partition. Yes, those peasants might identify as Poles, and yet they were not really trusting. Basically, somebody from the city, even a member of the intelligentsia, would be an alien. They would be strangers because you wouldn't know what they wanted. It was Wincenty Witos and other peasants activists that did a great job there. He later became one of the Polish prime ministers. So it was these activists who worked very hard to introduce the Polish peasants into the framework of the Polish national state. Basically, they knew that you cannot turn peasants into members of the nobility, or gentry, as some people called it. Those people would have their own ways of being, they have their own clothes. And what about communists? For example, communists believed that this communist Poland would be dominated by this peasants element. Coming back to this Great War, those peasants participate in the Great War, being who they were. So there is 1914. The Prussian, or in other words, German partition. Unfortunately, the interpreters are experiencing major technical difficulties. So, serfdom was abolished. And another important thing was this sense of solidarity. What about Polish priests? They would have various economic organizations, and they would work with craftsmen and members of nobility. They would form some kind of a unity. They would resist this German element in the German partition. What about Galicia, the Polish Galicia? We don't know how many people, how big a share of the society consider themselves Polish. Some of them did, some of them were halfway through, some of them didn't. Now, the situation was the worst in the Russian partition due to difficult political circumstances. The first Polish Peasants' Party is set up as late as 1915, once the Russian army has left the kingdom. So politically speaking, this was a very difficult environment. And the Polish peasants rooted for the Russian forces, which was a difficult situation, wasn't it? Now, the Polish legions. Who was the initiator? It was Józef Piłsudski. He was not actually the commander, but he is closely associated with them. At first, it is the intelligentsia that dominate in the legions, students. Only later will you see more craftsmen, more peasants. And with time, after some time, the majority is constituted by peasants and workers and laborers. So war was conducive to strengthening the Polish national identity. Professor Radzowski, I believe you may be interested in that. I'm sorry. The technical difficulties. So, Kościuszko, basically that is something that was strengthened and helped in constituting the Polish national identity. People worked for a common goal, namely this common identity. So, America and Poland. Some people would return from the US to Poland even before 1914, and they consider themselves Polish because in Cleveland, in Pittsburgh, in New York, they confronted themselves with other people who also spoke Polish, and this is what turned them into Poles. And those people who returned to Poland, they spread this idea of Polishness. So at a certain point, well, it would be difficult basically to say whether a majority consider themselves Polish. It would be a difficult guess in 1914. It was the war that changed the situation. It was then that the Polish church, the bishops, joined in those efforts to promote Polishness and the Polish history. So what happened after the Battle of Warsaw? Most of people who spoke Polish and who lived in this Poland reborn considered themselves Polish. They had this Polish national identity. Thank you very much. Łukasz, over to you. Or to the professor. I took over the mic, but just for a moment. Professor, thank you very much for this presentation. And now Damian Markowski will take the floor. We will hear a bit more about the microscale, namely what was happening in Lemberg, Lwów, or Lwów. Thank you very much, Łukasz. I've been listening to what was being said with great interest and with great satisfaction. It is great for me to be able to tell you about how important Lemberg was, or how Polishness was constituted. So the year is 1918, and at a certain point, a certain world finished for Galicia, namely the Austro-Hungarian Empire finished because there was this coup d'etat. As a result, Lemberg was supposed to be regained. It was supposed to be taken over by the Ukrainians. It was the first Ukrainian uprising, and that resulted in another uprising that broke out just a few hours later. Namely, it was the Poles and a few members of the Polish organizations. They responded in kind to the original military campaign, and thus a battle started in the streets of the city, and it would last for almost 22 days. So this was the end of the old world, the beginning of the new world. As it happens, this is a great moment to build new myths. In this context, it was the founding myth of the Second Polish Republic. Let's look at the very beginning, the very foundation of that myth. How could you summarize it? Basically, one simple sentence could be used to do that. Namely, children are fighting for the city. And that is how it was represented by the Polish propaganda, especially at the very beginning. So it was the fight for the Polish identity in the city of Lwów. And later, those events, this battle, was represented the following way. It was children. It was the innocent, pure children, the purest part of the society. They had to take up arms to fight for their homeland. First, they fought for their own homes, houses, streets, tenement houses, and then they would fight for Lwów, and soon they would fight for the whole region, namely the Eastern Galicia. Ultimately, it was about bringing back independence, sovereignty, and existence to the whole state. It was a new myth, and basically old myths was pushed away. Here we're talking about the myth of the Lwów eaglets. And thus the old myths was pushed into shadow. I mean the myths of the national uprisings. So this myth was made a part of this road of the Polish, this road to the Polish independence. We're talking about the year 1914 at this point.
That was this
fought in Austrian uniforms and under the Austrian auspices. And it was to finish with the sign of the White Eagle and the struggle for Polish identity. As is usually the case in such circumstances, the true historical truth, that is the actual cause, and the less praiseworthy events like the Lwów pogrom, which after the victory of the Polish armies resulted in the death of around 80 people of Jewish origin, and far many more were maimed and also looted. The Polish society is not currently free, and nor was it earlier free from a phenomenon that I would call the relay race of memory. Namely, I dare say that any European community has a particular set of national heroes, and it draws from them, reaches to that group to build their own statehood, something that own identity is based on. When it comes to the Polish example, we can speak, as I said, about the tradition of fighting for independence when Poland was partitioned. Then it turns into the heroic fight of the Polish legions. Then we fight for the independence and the borders of the Second Republic, which later, as you perhaps perfectly well realize, which would then be changed due to this lonely fight against two totalitarian systems in September and October 39, and then the Katyn crime, the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Uprising, the fight of Polish soldiers on all the fronts of the European theater of war, land and the sea. All that later removed from this pedestal the myth, the founding myth of the Second Republic. Then came the myth of the solidarity, and as something that managed to combat communism in Eastern Europe and helped to bring Poland as a democratic and independent state to the map of Europe. Of the Third Republic of Poland, that's after the fall of communism in Poland, the fashion for Lviv, if we can call it like that, was a novelty again, just like the fashion for Polish Eastern marches, Eastern lands. There's been this true outburst of kresy fancy, which was very emotional, but sometimes also free of reflection. I'm talking about this approach to Polish history in those lands and to what was happening at that time, mostly 1918, 1920, and during the Second World War as well. They began to function as an element that was lost, a part of the country that, for a variety of reasons, after the war found itself outside the Polish borders. All those movements found vent in popular culture and also, but I believe that it was at the very end, in scientific research. One could say that the fact that the Polish state, not only as a society, but also as people with diplomacy, found it necessary to work out a particular position towards the fate and the history of those Polish lands that were removed from Poland after the war forcefully, and that stayed beyond its borders, be it as part of the independent Belarusian, Ukrainian states, and Free Lithuania as well. You could say that the idea of cultural restitution of that place was returned to. Cultural restitution means that the quite marginal political voices in Poland were that could make some territorial claims after 1990 in that direction. These were just disregarded, but the country reached for those spaces culturally. So culture-wise, of course, the territorial integrity was retained, and assuming that the borders are binding. By the way, Poland was the first European country to recognize independence of Ukraine, but at the same time, claims were made for Polish history, which the history that was still vested in those walls. Still in Ukrainian days, when communism continued there, in the cemetery destroyed by Soviet tanks and hooligans, the Poles of Lwów would lay their flowers. The hands unknown to KGB would write words like "Poland remembers about you," "We will claim your tears," "The Polish nation doesn't forget you." And that was a monument that was torn by Soviet tanks, but even they never managed to tear it down fully. It was a part of this Polish-Ukrainian conflict for Lwów. Since 1980, we've had here a certain avalanche of events that will later result in Poland in a great increase of knowledge. In 1989, in Pasieki near Lwów, a Polish construction company, Energopol, started operation, and people working for Energopol started to work on saving the remnants of the cemetery of the defenders of Lwów. In May this year, in April 1990, the cemetery was visited by the first president of the Third Republic of Poland, and that was Wojciech Jaruzelski, one of the main authors of the martial law in Poland and the bloodshed against Polish democratic opposition in 1980. Jaruzelski received very ironic thanks from the local Poles that as a president he deigned to discover them and Lwów on the map of Poland. At the same time, in independent Poland, reconstruction of collective memory of the defense of Lwów was restituted. That was visible in the works of historians and also in the collective memory, that is the memory that reaches the largest numbers of people. It was there to shape the public space of now free Poland. A symbolic moment came with the unveiling of the monument to the Orlęta, to the eaglet, on the 11th November in Wrocław. Slowly, after reaching the way out of the chasm from the communism past, the Polish-Ukrainian conflict about history started to burn anew. The first thing was to finish the reconstruction of the cemetery. Now, to have it reconstructed as completely as it existed before the war, together with the columns of glory and with the inscriptions that perhaps the Ukrainian side did not really have to fancy. One of the best-known Ukrainian historians wrote in 2003, that's when the conflict was still rife. There is no other place in Ukraine, and perhaps many such other places in Eastern Europe, where discussions about national subjects would be as intensive as in Lwów. The cemetery was finally reopened, and the unveiling ceremony involved the presidents of Ukraine and Poland. However, it was only reduced form, not the pre-war. That was the form that finally the Ukrainian party were ready to accept. The outbreak of this unofficial Ukrainian-Russian war for Crimea and Donbas resulted mostly in Ukraine in very strong historical resentments they were not negative from the start, because in 2015, a short film was published to the Polish-Ukrainian fight for Lwów, and they used scenes with reenactors. And the message was that one day Poles and Ukrainians were fighting for Lwów, but now they are allies and partners in Europe. Later, those positive messages were lost because part of Ukrainian administration recognized that what they need is a harsher attitude towards the Polish partner. And also votes emerged that even in this form, the cemetery of the defendants of Lwów should be bereft of some other elements that were recreated in what was already independent Ukraine, that resulted in a lively decision of Polish authorities and a part of Polish society. We can say that some deeds of Polish tourists in Lviv become a part of local legend, as those tourists try to liberate two lions from their cardboard boxes. They symbolize the heroism of Polish defenders of the city, and those lions are in that very cemetery. This dispute was hot again when the Polish side wanted to put the image of the chapel from that cemetery on the Polish passport. It never happened finally. So the different narratives continue, and we could say that by now the fight for Lwów has taken one of the most important spaces in Polish collective memory and identity when it comes to the recognizability of 20th century events in Polish history. The defenders of Lwów again found themselves in different popular culture means books. There was even a board game that followed the fight for Lwów. Scientific research on the subject continues, and those events are still one of the hotspots in Polish-Ukrainian international relations as far as the policy of memory, of remembrance goes. The cult of the eaglets is still very much alive. I must say that there are at least 28 schools in Poland, of which 2 just in Warsaw have been named after the eaglets, after those young children. Every year, moreover, there are plenty of online materials for the anniversary of those fights. So we could say that, at least to a certain degree, that history, that part of history continues. That's been my introduction to the subject, and may I now encourage you to discuss that subject. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Doctor, for that tale where facts and history met commemoration and historical remembrance. We've already gone through all the papers, so I'm just now left to ask Professor Hittinger to conduct the session of questions and answers, that is the discussion with our authors. Thank you.
Thank you to all of the speakers for a very interesting and illuminating presentation on the importance of Lviv for in World War I, for something that still is present in memory and disputes. I have to say, I don't have access to all the people online, Łukasz, so I'm not in a position to take the questions and moderate. I don't see them. I could start with a question though, and then ask you to moderate. Does that sound good, Łukasz?
Oczywiście, tak to może wyglądać, ja bardzo chętnie pomogę, natomiast
Yes, obviously, I will help very gladly, but if there are any questions, questions should be in our chat. So I encourage all the people who are listening to us to enter their questions into the chat. So I believe, Professor, that we will ask you to start to ask several questions and just inaugurate our discussion. And then if only those questions are presented in the chat, I will be helping you also if need be.
Okay. Well, first, for Professor Markowski, just because that hit something that I was wondering about, I've spent some time frequently with students in Upper Silesia, in Katowice, and we learn about the uprisings and the struggle on the German border. And a question that came to mind was a big part of that narrative, of course, is the referenda that were held that allowed Poland to claim certain parts there around Katowice. Why was there nothing like that proposed on the eastern border? Was it because the populations were not as large, or perhaps they were not so intermingled, or there was not as much industrial value at stake? I'm just curious. And well, another side of the question, why would Poland even need, I understand the appeal of the eaglet myth. As a matter of fact, Professor Rudzielowski may know the answer to this, but my son went to a high school at Orchard Lake that was a Polish-American school, and they were the eaglets. And I never heard the story about the Lwów eaglets, but I'm sure there was some connection. But nevertheless, my point would be, with Lwów, it seemed so clearly a Polish majority that had a Polish vital life for centuries, whereas I was saying in Silesia, there seemed to be much more swirling of claims and counterclaims. So I guess my question is, why wasn't it more easy to resolve in the sense either by a referendum or B, just that, look, this is a Polish city clearly, as opposed to, Bytom or others in the West were obviously more under dispute.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie profesorze, za...
Professor, thank you very much. Thank you for this question. I will respond, but I need to mention that I'm not a great expert in the history of the Upper Silesia and the history of the Silesian uprising. But let me respond directly to your question. So here, what did we see? Both sides were not really willing to organize such a referendum. Now, what did the Poles hope for? The Polish side, the Polish party, hoped that they could take both Lwów and the whole region at large. Later, it turned out that fights continued, they dragged on. And there was this issue of the borderline, which is of key importance in this borderland between Poland and Ukraine. There, the situation was much more complicated than it was the case in Silesia, where we're talking about those Polish-Silesian-German relations. So here, the international mission of the Allies was supposed to take care of that, and those missions were sent both to Warsaw and to Lemberg, to Lwów. But then it turned out that the Polish suggestions were being rejected by the Ukrainian party, even those that who were more friendly. So the Polish party reached the conclusion that force will have to play a decisive role. In 1919, in March and April, it showed very clearly at the time Poland had no set borders. Over 65% of the Polish army being constituted at the time was fighting there in the east at this Polish-Ukrainian front line. And that goes to show to what extent force had to be used by the Polish authorities there. It goes to show why such a referendum was deemed impossible in those conditions. All the more so because the Allied missions also basically did not seem to be very keen on that.
Thank you. That helps explain it, I think. Further questions? Łukasz, do you see? Oh, here we go. For Professor Radzielowski, here's the question. Professor Fauba described in his paper the importance of the difference of the partitions for the development of Polish national identity before World War I, especially for the peasants. Is there any difference in the importance of the partition origin for Polish immigrants in the US in terms of development of national identity? I presume that means the German, Russian, or Austrian. Did that impact Polish consciousness in the United States?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the question. There were certainly differences in the initial immigration to the United States. We see people from, for example, the Kashubian or Silesian immigrants in the United States forming separate parishes and these kinds of things. And there appears to have been some divisions within the immigration, but of course, as the professor mentioned, we have people from all three partitions who are mingling together, and the divisions that existed within Poland at the time are being broken down within the United States relatively quickly. And so while we see some of those emerge, they're inter-community conflicts where we can find examples of those emerging of people, for example, from the Prussian partition looking down on Galicians as being less advanced, or some comments of this nature. But when it comes to the question of support for Polish independence, all of those differences are in a sense subsumed into a larger Polish identity. So we certainly still have communities that are, for example, strongly Kashubian, or have some strong ties to a particular region of Poland, and certainly in Chicago we see the mountain regions of the Tatras have special organizations devoted simply to those regions. But when it comes to the larger question of Polish identity, all those groups joined together and worked with one another very closely.
Thank you. I should put in a word for our institute. Just recently had a lecture on Polish Texans, which describes the various waves and which regions just to the state of Texas the Poles originated from, and that is on our website. Are there further questions? Please put in a chat. I wonder, I will fill in now and ask one of Professor Fauba. And that is, you mentioned, of course, the Battle of Warsaw and the hope that the Bolsheviks had that the peasants, presumably of both Poland and the Ukraine, would turn to the cause of the International Workers' Party and abandon nationality or other ties. I just wonder if you could say more about key factors that just kept that area. I'm assuming the Ukrainians as well, but focus on the Poles from seeing some economic interest that would be served by the Soviet and Bolshevik appeal. Was it religion, for example, or other factors?
Dziękuję bardzo. Z pewnością tak, ale może
Thank you very much. Religion, surely, but I will begin with what the Soviets actually offered. So Bolsheviks did not really agree on a single idea that would make it possible to win over the Central and Eastern European people. So some Bolsheviks would say, yes, we will take over all of the land from landowners and we would create those huge state-owned farms. Others would say something else. We will take this land that used to belong to landowners and we will distribute them among peasants. So there were those differences, they were never settled. Ultimately, it was translated into propaganda, and this propaganda was inconsistent. Let's look at peasants' nature. They were distrustful by nature, weren't they? We've already mentioned that. So they didn't know what to believe. Some leaflets told them one thing, and another leaflet would tell them something completely else. That's the first thing. Secondly, Bolsheviks did not want to win over landowners, even peasants that owned land. To them, even peasants or farmers were reactionaries. They saw some potential in laborers that worked for landowners. So the Bolsheviks wanted to message those laborers. Now, the question is, to what extent were they successful in reaching out to them? Well, they were not, to be honest. There were some of those who would be actually willing to join the Red Army. But what happened after the Battle of Warsaw? Well, then the Red Army started to flee, and those foreknowns, freshly recruited laborers, would also desert and return to their own families and to their own land. At the end of October, the Polish detachment of the Soviet army, of the Red Army, had only 190 people. 190 people. 2/3 of them were Jews. So Bolsheviks were not really successful there, not at all. Secondly, it was due to the fact that the Polish counter-propaganda was quite effective. There was the psychological war that was raging there. You know, Poland on the one hand and Soviets on the other. And the messaging played a very important role, and various channels were used. Oral medium, leaflets distributed from planes. Actors would perform, poets and novelists would speak to soldiers on both sides of the front.
Kwestią podstawową była religia.
In the case of Polish peasants, it was the religion that was the fundamental binding force. They didn't really feel fully Polish. They only understood it around 1920, but they felt they were Catholics. As a Catholic, they couldn't accept the Bolsheviks, who were presented as those who destroy churches, murder prisoners of war, rape women, murder people, who take away land from the peasants, who confiscate lands. They not only don't give peasants new land, but they also take away the old land they had. Beginning with July, every day in Jasna Góra by the monastery, there were all the prayers with several dozens of thousands of peasants. And on the holiday of the 15th of August, there were 150,000. That was already during the Battle of Warsaw. Peasants were sworn, remember, Bolsheviks are coming. They will take away everything you have, and they will destroy, they will take away what is most precious for you. That is, they will take away your religion. There will be no God. There will be no Holy Mary in Vilnius, in Częstochowa. There will be no worship for Christ. And I believe that was the factor number one. I believe there were also other factors that were here of secondary importance. And we know that Bolsheviks lost and they were defeated. When we're talking about the sources of defeat in the Battle of Warsaw, the decisive factor here was the lack of readiness of the Polish society, especially Polish peasants, to cooperate with the Bolsheviks. They were alone. And being alone, they couldn't win that war. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any further questions want to be offered to these speakers today?
I'm wondering, I have a question for Professor Markowski, and particularly with regard to Lwów, and the role of the smaller communities within the city, particularly, for example, the Armenian community. If you could comment on the role of the Armenian community, not only in 1918, supporting Polish independence, or perhaps being skeptical, but also in the years that have followed, how Armenians who have deep roots in Lwów, how they would perceive the ongoing disputes over the memory of Lwów and the events of 1918 and 1919.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie profesorze.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that question. We could say that I'll have to do a specific shortcut because, as far as I know, the Armenian questions, and I studied those in quite a detail, you could say that Armenians as a group practically accepted the Polish point of view of these matters. Armenians, even on the 1st of November 1918, were among Polish insurgents, and then in the Polish detachments, troops. So they were part of the troops fighting for the Polish Lwów. And many Armenians died for Lwów's belonging to Poland. You could also say that the fight to have Lwów within Poland reborn was also connected with the Catholic hierarchy. It had two phases. Well, on the forefront, there was this Roman Catholic Church, but on the other hand, you had the Armenian Archbishop, Excellence Theodorovich, who also participated in a very significant manner in the bolstering of the spirit of his congregation, his sheep, if I can call them like this. And then he also participated in all the events commemorating that and assigning a special status to Lwów in the Second Republic of Poland, because he participated in all the events And that was important for the development of the legend. For example, the Marshal of Poland, Józef Piłsudski, awarding the city with Virtuti Militari. That later was only presented to Warsaw for the defense in September 39, for the defense against the German troops. So this tradition of the Armenian fight for the independence of Poland continued and survived, if I may use the word, to the Second World War, when Polish Armenians also participated in the Home Armies movements in Eastern Galicia. They also incurred great losses due to UPA campaign. To my knowledge, at least 2 villages that were inhabited by Polish Armenians considering themselves Poles were massacred during the UPA attacks. So that's, in the briefest of a brief, what I can share with you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if it's now time to see our promotional videos. Pani Płaski, proszę zacząć filmy.
Bardzo dziękuję za
Thank you very much for the introduction to the videos. Perhaps I will show them in a minute. Just give me a few seconds to manage all the technicalities, and we'll be able to see them in a minute.
Pierwszy film, który zobaczymy, będzie filmem.
The first thing we are going to see is connected to Professor Andrzej Chwalba's book, The People of Poland at War, and then we will see the video that speaks of Dr. Markowski's book. Let's have a look.
1914, the great powers clashed and waged a war that shaped lives of generations. In the wake of the great conflict, some new nations emerged. Others recovered their long-lost independence. This book tells the story of a nation divided for over a century between 3 empires. A tale of heroism and defiance, of patriots who wanted to fly their own colors. Far from the trenches of Verdun and the rocky shores of Gallipoli, a different war was being waged. A war for independence and freedom. After over a century of oppression, Poland was to be free again. People of Poland at War, 1914 to 1918, by Professor Andrzej Chwalba. Available on Amazon.
I szanowni państwo, teraz przechodzimy do drugiego z filmów.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we're now passing to the second video. It's a video presenting the book of Dr. Markowski.
Ornamented by splendid monuments of architecture, renowned for its scholarship, arts, and sciences. Leopolis, once the regional capital of Galicia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, could vie with Prague or Vienna for grandeur. Each of the ethnic communities that inhabited it, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, Armenians, to name but the largest, considered Lwów its very own. When the Habsburg Empire crumbled, the flames of civil war engulfed the City of Lions. Two uprisings in 1918 by Damian K. Markowski is a book which tells the story of the bitter contention, looking at developments from the point of view of both belligerents. Available on Amazon.
W ten sposób, Szanowni Państwo, chcieliśmy zachęcić Was do
Just
sięgnięcia
like, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to invite you to reach for those books. You can find them on Amazon, among others, and probably you'll be able to find them also in your libraries, because the distribution of these books is quite extensive also in US libraries. So I encourage you. And I believe that once we've seen those materials, now time to extend all the words of gratitude to wrap up this meeting. In my name and on behalf of the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation, I'd like to thank the Houston host, Professor Hittinger, and also Professor Radzilowski, our speaker, for being here with us and for enriching this meeting with your addresses, with your presence. Thank you very much for that. May I also thank our authors, without whom this meeting would have been impossible. It would have also been impossible without your books. I hope that this book has increased the number of our readers, and that you, as experts, as researchers, have drawn one from another during this meeting, and also from our hosts, and that in some way this meeting will also help you in your work. I have a question whether one of you gentlemen would like to make some wrap up, to take the floor for closing. I'll be very glad to give you the floor. Then, once again, thank you very much, and I hope that this is not our last meeting with you, and I count on continuation. I count on cooperation with the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and also with Professor Radzilowski, and we encourage you to follow our website, fundacjakurtyki.pl, where you will find information about the successive meetings. And all that I'm left to do is to say goodbye today and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Do widzenia.